Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be talking about data mesh, what's different about it, what it means to DWP, and how you might approach it yourselves. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by Charlie Boundy, Deputy Director and Head of Data Science at DWP Digital, alongside Andrew Carr, Solutions Architect at ScottLogic. Now, if you would like to ask a question to Charlie or Andrew, get them into the Q&A box and we will take as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And at the end of the webinar, we will ask you to complete a very quick 1-minute survey, but I'll give you a bit more information about that at the end. So without any further ado, let me pass you over to today's speakers. And I think we're starting with you, Andrew.
Thank you, Claire. So yes, thank you for joining this presentation from Charlie and myself. I shall jump straight into it. Yeah, I guess introduction to myself. I've been involved in data engineering in some form or other since around the year 2000, when I started working on processing call data records for, at the time, a company called Nortel Networks. I'm now a solution architect at ScottLogic, and I've been interested in all things data ever since then. And Charlie, I don't know whether you want to say a quick word about yourself.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Charlie Boundy. So I work within data and analytics within digital. I've been a civil servant for the last coming up to 5 years. After lots of work within retail and telcos and government departments and various other places. So yeah, really keen to update you on what we're doing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie. We should probably have a conversation about telcos at some point then. So yes, I guess in this presentation, we're keen to talk to you about data meshes. What is a data mesh? What's different about it as an approach? Some of the kind of key things to think about in terms of making sure it's a success. And then I'll hand over to Charlie to chat a little bit about the DWP and what they're doing in this area. Then just kind of chew through a few things, a few suggestions in terms of if you're thinking of approaching it, how might you approach it, and then really pull that together in a summary. And really the kind of threads that I want to pull together, I guess, during this presentation is really, as well as giving you a little bit of information about a data mesh, get you to think about your own requirements, think about if you do want to go to the data mesh approach, really thinking about the enabling platform and thinking about the huge mindset change that is data as a product. So let's go straight in. So data lakes, I'm sure most of you are probably familiar, well, probably most of you are familiar with data lakes. They really took off when Hadoop and HDFS came out after the kind of Google white papers on how to do distributed filing systems and MapReduce. I've also done a presentation on, I guess, the history of data lakes. But really, there was a huge move to centralizing data lakes in organizations. So when people were using data warehouses, the data warehouses could either be centralized or join with the teams, but data lakes were often very much centralized. And I guess there were a number of reasons why that, and we won't go through all those today, but technology was a big driver behind that. In fact, the technologies were quite different to some of the technologies before, both in how they operate and how to maintain them and how to use them. And because of these differences, what happened was a lot of organizations decided it was quite specialized skills to run these data lakes. You know what, let's centralize it. And I guess after the last few years, we've all learned a big kind of step forward in our understanding of what it means to run a centralized data lake and the implications of that. And there's been huge implications. I guess what's tended to happen at the beginning, you know, all the raw data was held in a centralized data lake. We obviously got to the point where people started having staging areas where you'd have more curated data. It tended to be owned by data engineers and data scientists, commonly because the raw data was sent to the centralized systems. The raw data would often hold idiosyncrasies of the source systems. And there were huge challenges, I think, in most large organizations around permission, access, governance, and the whole suite of more complex things. So while data lakes were amazing in that you could get the data centrally, and we all had a big step up in terms of questions we could ask, it created more challenges in terms of data governance, data access, permissions, and a whole suite of other challenges came forward after data lakes. So I guess that brings us on to, a blog post about the data mesh, which was first proposed by ThoughtWorks, but to be honest, was a kind of an approach that people were talking about at the time anyway. And I think a good few organizations have started their journey down this, and some have implemented a data mesh approach in their organizations. And this is really the very different approach of, instead of centralizing a data lake into a centralized team, you're really pushing the data back to the source teams. So it's very different in that this decentralized approach, the team themselves own their own data. And these teams can use technologies like data warehouses, data lakes, all the same sorts of technologies, but actually it's a very different approach in that it's a domain-driven design and bounded context. And what I mean by that is, you won't have one organization or one team across the whole organization trying to map everything. You tend to have teams that own their own domain and the design around that. And then when they need to share data, the kind of link points, there's discussions about how those federated identifiers work. And yeah, there's big challenges around that. And I guess to enable this, it tends to be a common sort of platform to enable this kind of deployed, decentralized data mesh approach. So as we talked about, the very differences about the data mesh are really down to who owns the data as well as the technology. And this data as a product mindset shift is really quite a big change for a lot of organizations. So there's been a driver in many organizations for the business to own more the data anyway, instead of the technology teams, whereas historically it tended to be technology teams. But I think this is a kind of a further push towards that. And really, so I guess a couple of other implications from that is the platform tends to need to be non-domain specific. Although as an organization, it can understand the organization, you tend to need to then not put the business rules into the platform itself. And then when you push back these tools back to the local IT teams, you tend to need to have the IT teams need to be able to use the data engineering tools. And there's been a huge move in the market in terms of the tools, making them easier to use. But also, if you look at some of the technologies like Spark and Kafka, etc., they've all started introducing technologies which more software engineers tend to use, like SQL type technologies. And this has made it much easier for general software engineers to start using some of these data engineering tools. So from my point of view, and really to kind of help think in terms of this, I guess, data as a product, I find it helpful to classify some of the tools into these categories. So a bunch of tools around the data flow management. And this is really about how to get the data in and out, kind of ETL or ELT, depending on where you're doing the transformations. A whole bunch of tools around how you manage data as a product. And I guess these tools are really coming into their own, and there's lots of discussions about these. And certainly when you move to a data mesh, there's a real focus on these areas of tools. And then what I call consumer data tools, or kind of end use tools. So tools to consume the data and use it, whether that be some kind of BI tool like Power BI or Tableau, or whether you're talking about some tool that the data scientists use, like Apache Spark or PySpark, or some other tools to consume the data in some way. And if I hand over to Charlie for the DWP part.
And where we're going to have to do the obligatory next slide, please. Thank you, Andrew. So I guess in context, the data mesh is something that we kind of reached the conclusion. We were looking around for where there might be something that guides us, because things were getting almost too big in terms of the data types and the data needs that we had to do. And the traditional approaches were just prohibitively expensive and a security nightmare. And we've been working with Scott Logic, among several others, about the different nodes in this picture. And what's been great is they, like others, have been working together and understanding how to work together and do that along with our own engineering team, so we can maintain these things ourselves. And there's quite a lot that we're learning as we go. So let me give you some context. So if you can go to the next slide for me. It's probably really important to understand where DWP fits and it's the landscape that it's operating in at the moment. So I could probably spend most of this conversation talking about the top left-hand corner. So fundamentally, in terms of we're around about 5% unemployment now, which had been steadily quite low for a long historical amount of time, but has peaked at, has spiked to 5%. And we've also got over 10 million people on various forms of employment schemes. And if you think about it as well in wider context of a population that's had, well, certainly some of the population in education have had a real constrained time in terms of loss of learning. But there's also about 4.5 million people on NHS waiting lists. So there's a physical and mental well-being kind of challenge ahead for a whole lot of us, and a whole way of supporting that population. So COVID in itself, it was a huge task for us around about March in the first lockdown last year. And obviously that's just meeting a surge of demand. And the mobilization of people and technology then was huge. And we're looking at potentially another one as things start relaxing the lockdown a little bit more. So there's things there that, again, we're braced for impact, and that was really, we needed to accelerate our transformation. But the wider context hasn't gone away that was before COVID, and is sort of underlying it is that our sort of trading conditions, our economy is going to shift and alter on the back of exiting the EU in ways we are still learning. The levelling up agenda is a key government manifesto agenda, so that's something that we are square behind. And the world of what employers are looking for, as you know, productivity challenges in the UK were huge, skills challenges. There's an awful lot of things there which are new skills, new ways of working, and an adapting labour market. So there's a lot changing in that kind of context. If you go to the next slide for me. So we have really, we've been working on three core strategies, sorry. And they are things which we've had to accelerate as a result of the economic situation and the health situation over the last year. So the big things to really emphasize here is our business strategy is a fantastic, ambitious but necessary step change, really. Looking at moving us to much more less kind of line of business focused, much more citizen centric focus, which probably isn't a surprise for a lot of people elsewhere in industry, but it's something that really needed a major kind of catalyst to change. Being much more citizen centric, being able to be much more data driven, look at more preventative work that either helps people through progression in their earnings, also looking at how we reduce the kind of fraud and error and debt burden that might happen as a result. So there's lots of things where we're looking to tailor our services much more. Digital is again another ambitious kind of strategy and framework and blueprint to support that, with much more reusable services, much more cloud-based, much more event-driven, and that's not just kind of digital events, but also ultimately at claimant contact level, designing our services around life events as well. So again, another kind of shift in terms of how digital operates and deliver, which has been ongoing, but we're probably really at our peak. And the data strategy is a key part of that as well, to making sure that we're hitting our strategic goals with the data that's needed. And that is not, here's all these fantastic analytics things we can do. It's also very heavily balanced towards the how do we make sure we're gathering the right data in the right way that's properly structured, properly governed, maintains privacy throughout, and considers the ethical implications of things, which I'm always at pains to say, in terms of us using and being more intelligent, we're not talking about calculating entitlement. We're talking about how we support and manage contact and deal with workloads across the department. So those are the things where we're getting much smarter and much more effective and efficient at what we do. So yeah, if you can go to the next slide for me. If you imagine then kind of, well, what does that mean from a data mesh point of view, and why is that relevant? So really the data demands have grown quite significantly from a lot of work that we've been doing over the last 4 years. And I guess historically as well, have meant that new pockets of important data work have kind of spawned or been created. Historically, DWP has got a really strong heritage in the policy design space and the official statistics space, and that is get hold of your claims data and really understand what the population looks like. How do you understand what the forecasts for welfare needs are? How do you understand what the impacts are if policy changes happen? And that's been the kind of bedrock cornerstone of what we've done with data in the department. And However, as we've gone more digital and started to shift more services kind of online, and huge welfare change programs like Universal Credit, there's an urgency to look at how that is being developed and how people are experiencing that, where people may be struggling in the service, where there's different groups that need more dedicated design work. So we've had the luxury of being able to agile and iteratively design our services with data underpinning it, not just web analytics, but also how people are interacting in other channels and through into the service itself. So that customer service element has been a really important thing for new digital services as they've created. It's been important to kind of make sure we're getting the right diagnostics and usage and telemetry and performance analytics in amongst that. The other thing we're going online is you've got a different security, fraud and error set of risks to deal with. There's really important things for us to do there around protective monitoring, not only kind of, at your cybersecurity level, but also other types of users. We've also got huge ambitions there pushing forward into transaction risking and digital identity and service differentiation. So you can kind of see things there are needing to be not just gathering data and seeing performance, but also feeding that intelligence back into the service to make it better and more relevant to the individual that's using it. And alongside that, with COVID as well, comes now much more optimizing our operations, understanding the labour market dynamics better. And so there is, again, looking at those things in context for saying, well, what is happening? How can we look at things more at kind of resourcing level, or at even a states level, and even I've seen plans in future as well around the green agenda and how we can manage our kind of estates footprint and things like that. So there's inevitably things coming up here where pockets of data sets kind of are growing, and the volume of data we're talking about is much different to what we would have experienced literally 5 years ago, if not not soon before that. So different things, but not all of that data needs to be in one bucket. So yeah, Andrew, next slide. So yeah, so most people will know this kind of paradigm has kind of evolved from the enterprise data warehouse to the data lake to the data mesh. I think our experience on that journey is that the enterprise data warehouse, really the core data warehouse, is what serviced a lot of our long-standing use case around policy analysis and statistics and various forms of MI. And that's fine when you're dealing with a world that's, I guess, largely offline. Those are the things where, you've got telephony and paper-based claims and things like this, where that's fine. That's the sort of stuff where really all you've got to work on is data from the claim itself. As you're going more online, people start going, wow, we need something much bigger that's be able to kind of pour all of our information into, and hence the data lake worlds that most departments have been going through and saying, right, let's look at all of that and see what it's telling us, what is there to discover in all of that information. But the consequence of doing that is it's identified a bunch of data products that we want to industrialize, and we want to kind of make sure that people can get access to things rather than purely just innovation and seeing what you could do with data. So the data lake on its own was something which needed a much more kind of wrapped around it in terms of operationalizing things. But the buckaroo analogy kind of happens again. If you pile too many things on top of this, eventually it's going to kick. And if you are trying to kind of pour all of your information into one place, it creates new and different headaches and massive queues for people waiting to get access to their data and making it data in a usable format, etc. So it becomes a real challenge. And so the data mesh is something that really attracted us as we were identifying that these domains were building up their own data capabilities, or needed to build up their own data capabilities and not wait for some central function to eventually get around to them. So yeah, so I think that gets us into that place where we can start looking at analytics in much more online terms, not just offline terms. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is sort of final kind of view for me in terms of where we're at. So a data mesh, I think as a term, it's a useful one for understanding what people are trying to achieve. And it's, you know, you can argue it's quite a trendy one as well, and people say, oh, you've got to have a data mesh. If you've got a data lake, you know, it's the thing you need to have. But I think it's something which, you know, it's something we're not purely being guided by, because there's still a lot to learn, but it's something we're saying, right, okay, we do recognize that the business needs to have some of these things, and there's really sound and solid reasons for it. The big advantage is definitely around security and GDPR. So to put all of our data in one place makes it a very attractive target. It means that also you're putting lots of different users and diverse users, and anything up to thousands of users potentially. But you know, that's wood for the trees territory, as well as a security headache. From a GDPR point of view, it's also really valuable because you will always be questioned about proportionality and data minimization and justifiable uses of data. But if you can keep the data owner of the node in that mesh has justifiable use for all of their 100% of data, but somebody upstream or downstream of that really only needs a fraction because it's relevant to their use case, then that is proportionate. That domain-driven aspect across security, fraud and error, digital service design, digital workplace, these are all things which, yeah, the domain itself should be masters of their data and the diagnostics that it delivers and what it tells them and the analytics that can go with that. So that's getting us into data products. And so we've been having some interesting evolution within our agile teams to put data specialists within them. So not just data scientists, but you know, digital performance analysts, data engineers, and starting to get the product owners of these agile teams to be more confident with what a data product is and what it could do, and the usual trade-offs between what the user need is versus what the data can do. And some of those kind of learnings have been really, really valuable for how you make sure that the business, the various parts of the business know what they could have with the right kind of shape around it. But moving from a sort of centralized thing to a decentralized thing just brings different challenges, not necessarily easier ones. And so there is still a lot to learn. And I think the points I've raised here, there's interesting questions for operating models, there's interesting questions for data governance. And how do you get the right oversight across these things to make sure that your total cost of ownership, your reuse, all these sorts of things kind of come into this. Cloud skills and standards, that's the sort of thing which moving to cloud, getting the right infrastructure basis for this, the right kind of security reuse around these things, and building up the skills within your teams to be confident enough to use this so you can sustain it yourself and exploit it and evolve it yourself. That's a really, really key thing to get right, and we're still learning from teams as we get a much bigger footprint there. And that final point really is that, you know, this isn't a reference architecture that the mesh is coming up with. It's not telling you what your data model is, what your data standards are, what your interoperability needs to be across your different domains. But those are things that still need to be looked at. Those are things that you need to understand. Well, within a domain, there is that autonomy, but between domains, you know, you need to make sure that various things can talk to each other properly. So I think that brings new challenges and slightly different challenges, but in the context of cost and security and being able to deliver into different areas much quicker and much more relevant to the use case, that's a huge step forward for us. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Charlie. I think that's a really interesting conversation you just went through, and it's really interesting to hear the journey that you've been on from enterprise data warehouse to data lake, and then considering a more decentralized data mesh approach. And I guess it's not a story that it's not a story that's isolated to the DWP. That's a common story that I guess you hear about from many organizations, and certainly the fact that the data lakes was quite a technology driven approach where, you know, a lot of us ended up implementing centralized data lakes, and they did give us a big step up from the data warehouse originally. But I guess the key thing for me is that centralized team didn't quite mirror the organization that they worked on. worked within. And I guess when you see tech teams that work well, often the tech team will mirror the organization as a whole. So there's this push back to the teams that actually own their own data and owning the data as a product, and what that means and the implications on the team. It does seem to be a bit more of a move back to the tech team, I guess, mirroring the organization. And given that, and given quite a few of the things you said, Charlie, which I think, you came up with some great points that actually this is the start of a journey for quite a few people. And there's, a lot of questions. This kind of going down the data mesh approach brings up as many questions as it does answers. It's going to take time for us all to work through and work out, what should be in the platform, how should the platform be, how do you do this well? And I guess given that journey, I would definitely recommend a more agile approach to this platform building. I think a long approach where if you took all the features you would require in the platform and you could come up with a lot of features, whether that, data quality, data lineage, data governance, permissions, controls, etc. There's a lot of features you could come up with. You could spend a long time building a platform. And I guess for most organizations to be able to get this and make this a reality quickly, there are probably some small components you can build as a platform and start on the agile process of moving to a data mesh, and then iteratively in an agile approach, introduce more things instead of the big bang trying to build a huge platform and it taking a few years. And certainly given that I guess a lot of us are at the beginning of this journey, it's better to do it in a more agile approach. I just want to say before I go to the next slides, even though they probably look like Lego bricks, they don't have Lego on them, and other bricks are available. So just in the interest of being tech agnostic here. So one thing I do want to go through, quite a few people are on this kind of journey of considering a data mesh. One thing I would say, particularly if you're going to consider whether to go to cloud or non-cloud, the cloud option does give you a huge jump forward. And I'm going to mainly talk in terms of speed to be able to glue this stuff together. And the reason why is quite a few of the cloud providers have done all the gluing together for you. So if you take AWS, for example, AWS Glue, Amazon EMR, they have a whole suite of tools that plug together really nicely. And the speed which, if you can control the number of cloud providers you provide, and that's a big if for some organizations, it can significantly speed up the speed of end-to-end where you start off and hone your platform and make it available to your departments. So having a single cloud provider will get you there a lot easier and faster if it's possible. It's not always possible. The different providers have different glue tools, but they all kind of do similar things. And obviously other cloud providers are available. I love open source tools. I think, if you look at Hadoop and HDFS and lots of these tools, Spark, Flink, Kafka, they've moved the world forward immeasurably quickly now. And I think there are some amazing open source tools available around processing and streaming. And for the consumer data tools, I think they're getting quite advanced. And there's lots of great paid for tools as well, the Power BI, Tableau for the end user stuff. And it really has moved the market. Now, the one thing I would say with the open source stuff, because there's so many tools, there is an absolute massive headache in lining all the versions of all these tools up and making sure they all work together. As well as that, it can actually be really complicated actually managing and configuring some of these tools. I mean, Apache Kafka is it's quite a specialist knowledge to actually understand how to configure and run it. Same with Hadoop's cluster, Spark cluster, etc., etc. And so if it's possible for you, I definitely recommend the managed service. It will take a lot of the operational pain away. In terms of data flow management, which we talked about earlier, there are some great tools out there. I just happened to pick two good open source tools, StreamSets and Apache NiFi. Commonly, they build upon other technologies as well. StreamSets, for example, builds upon Apache Spark and really does make it a lot easier to kind of get there quickly. And as we discussed, some of the three themes I want to get across and pull together in the summary is really, what are you trying to do with a data mesh? I don't think there's a out-of-the-box data mesh implementation. It's very much an approach, and so you have to ask yourself, what are your requirements and what are you trying to achieve? If you are going for a data mesh in your organization, the enabling platform is absolutely key. And we talked about how, if you have an enabling platform, the sorts of things you might need inside it, and the huge mindset change data as a product. And this is really about the business owning the data. Because ultimately, if they want results from the data, the key is the quality of the data that they're using. So if there's a close link between them seeing the data quality and them maintaining the data and then seeing the results that they can get out from that data, I really think that, you know, there's going to be a much higher chance of that data being high quality, as opposed to which historically has happened in many organizations where the IT team own the data and are responsible for data quality. And then at the very end of the cycle, when the business come back and start to ask questions and the IT team go, well, okay, if we realized that was going to be a question 2 years ago, we would have designed the system differently, or we would have, you know, made sure there was data quality around these areas, and we haven't done that, so we can't give you good answers for that data. And I guess on that, to make it easier for the business, there are paid for tools around the you know, supporting data as a product, and there's lots of amazing tools out there, you know, from Informatica, SAP, Oracle, Talent, IBM, etc. But a lot of these tools have tended historically to be quite technical. Often the way you need to manage your data can be quite complex. So these tools have had to be correspondingly complex, which means that they've typically been needed to be quite well-trained people, developers or the like, to be able to use these tools. Whereas if we're moving more to a model where the business need to use the tools really need to be designed in such a way to be the language of the business themselves. So certainly in this area, I would recommend at least considering bespoke building the tools to really fit it towards the business users. So it mirrors their business process as much as possible and really makes it easy for them to manage data as the product. So just starting to pull stuff together before we get to the summary. Data mesh is really an approach. It's definitely not just a technology problem. It's a real mindset change to data as a product. Data quality can often be a big driver for that. The results you want out very much depend on the quality of the data that you have. There's often going to be big challenges how you migrate away from older ways of doing it to the new world. As Charlie has mentioned, a lot of organizations such as the DWP are on this journey, and there is no simple answer yet. There's no, this is a data mesh implementation, this is a reference architecture you should go with. So I think over the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to all work out the best way to do this. That I guarantee you there will be a lot of pain on the way. We'll probably learn a lot by trying this out. Given that, I very much recommend an agile approach to trying to do this. And I really do recommend you have a real reflect on the business drivers of why you're trying to do this, because those requirements will really fit key into the platform and how, you know, what you need to build in the platform. So I don't know whether we're finishing super fast. I tend to be fast at presenting. It seems like Charlie is too, which is good because we're trying to optimize your time, because I suspect you're all very busy. But to pull it together, this is really the summary slide. And then I think Charlie and I are going to go through this and then chat through any questions you have. But Charlie, do you want to go ahead on the scale and maturity bit first?
Thank you. So I think the reality with the data mesh is there is definitely a question of scale here. Obviously, DWP is huge, and therefore it has found itself with multiple use cases, and yeah, you know, redeveloping a data warehouse every 5 years or its lifetime, etc., is prohibitively expensive if everything's in one basket. So I think DWP's size definitely lends itself to that space, and there's obviously several departments in that space as well. It does raise interesting questions in government of starting to think about almost a mesh across government, where instead of us doing lots of data sharing requests that take a long time to argue for a copy of someone's data, really, we should only be directly querying what we need to deliver the service that we need, whether that's granting an entitlement to something or something similar. So I think it's really important to understand where you're at in your journey in terms of how mature your use cases are. Have you got really advanced needs around your service design or your channel analytics or your cybersecurity or whatever? Or is there still only one kind of core fundamental part of the business and it can all be in one conceptual node? But inevitably departments like DWP and others will say, we've been asking to understand your data, can we query it in ideally real time to deliver our services? in the way that works and is proportional and so on. So yeah, I think there's two things in there, is just really understanding where you're at in understanding how you want to make better use of your own data, and is that starting to kind of divide between 3-4 parts of your organization that are very distinct from each other, whether that's finance or customer insight or whatever. So I think, yeah, those are the things to be key.
Cool. So the enabling platform, so as well as working out whether the use cases you've got merit going down the data mesh approach, as Charlie has talked about, the enabling platform for me is absolutely key, because if you're going to go down the route of, as I'll talk about in a sec, the kind of data as a product, you really need to bring the business on that journey for you. So the enabling platform is absolutely key to how you get there. And certainly, Charlie, you talked about employing data engineers in your kind of agile teams, so that then you're decentralizing that knowledge instead of having one specialist team with all the kind of data engineers. Really kind of using that enabling platform to help the local IT teams use and quickly be able to deploy APIs and provide data is also key, because ultimately, if it's really hard for them to do it, they're going to create shortcuts, or they're not going to be able to provide the data as, and then the temptation is just to go back and use the data lake as opposed to using the new data mesh. And I guess moving on to data as a product, as I said, it's really key to get business buy-in, and key for me is making the tools available so the business find it really easy to use. Because if it's an uphill struggle for them to manage data as a product, you're really not going to then get all the benefits of a working data mesh and being able to provide data to different departments and know that the data is of the right quality and that has the correct data governance around that, and really kind of sharing data around the organization, and as I'm sure we'll discuss in a minute when we have further questions, the data mesh does bring up a load of challenges as well. We haven't had time to go through all those challenges. Interoperability, data merging between different departments, where you have to have global identifiers so that you can merge the data. All of these become more complicated when you're using a data mesh, as opposed to having the old way, having one big data dictionary, one metadata describing everything that's going on, and it's all in one place. It definitely becomes more complex with a data mesh, and I guess over the next 4 or 5 years we'll work out together jointly the best way to approach all this.
Yeah, just add one final thing on that. So I think this slightly answers one of the questions. I think it was from Andy. The data as a product, and how you interface to that data. It's quite easy to dump data into a place where then you rely on very specialist technical data capable people to be able to access that and get some value from it. And it's only when you start realizing that they can increasingly turn that into a product which answers a business need more regularly, more easily, that you can continue to enhance that product with those data specialists, rather than have them constantly be the channel to that data. So I think there is that product thinking. We'll answer it in a little bit more depth, but that definitely comes with working within agile teams who are multidisciplinary.
Claire, over to you.
Thank you both so much for that really excellent presentation, and a huge thank you to Charlie for taking time out of your really busy schedule to come and talk to us all today. It is much appreciated, so thank you both.